Hey guys, tonight we begin with the soft hush of wind rolling over a sunburnt hill of silence. No footsteps, no laughter, no memory of water, just the dry breath of the earth rising slowly, like incense from a cracked clay bowl. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because tonight, we're not telling the story of kings or soldiers or empires etched in stone. We're going somewhere quieter, somewhere the names have long blown away, but the lives still echo gently in. The dust dot in the far deserts of Egypt, back when the Roman Empire was fraying like the hem of an old tunic, there were men who chose to vanish. Not because they were hunted, not because they were punished, but because they longed for a silence the world could not give them. These were monks, though they wouldn't have called themselves that. Not at first. Just wanderers with calloused feet and hearts worn thin from too much noise. They came with nothing, and left even less. But for a short time, a blink in history's tired eyes, they lived in a kind of stillness that's hard to find now, even in sleep. A silence that didn't just hush the mouth. It hushed the soul. Let's drift east now, past the cities, past the Nile, into the dry heart where men went to disappear, and where the wind still remembers them, whispering their names through rock, reed, and ash. The desert doesn't keep what it's given. Not footsteps, not shadows, not names. Everything fades, softened by wind and sun, until even memory has no place to land. And maybe that's why they came here, men with too much noise in their past, or too much ache in their prayers. They didn't walk in like prophets. They arrived as strangers, wrapped in old cloaks, their sandals split at the seams, eyes half blinded by the light. Some were young and trembling. Others had faces already folded by time. None of them looked important. And that was the point. There were no gates waiting for them. No ceremony. Just heat and silence and an endless stretch of stone that neither welcomed nor refused. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. They didn't come to build something. They came to stop. To stop climbing, stop speaking, stop chasing answers. The desert was less a place than a pause, a place to sit down in the middle of everything and wait for the noise inside to wear itself out. And still, they moved slowly, purposefully, as though looking for something they couldn't name. A cave. A shaded crack in the cliffside. A bit of broken ruin where the wind sounded just right. And when they found it, they stayed. That was the beginning of their monastery. Not with stone walls or grand plans, just a man sitting still, long enough for the silence to shape itself around him. And then another, and another. The desert taught them not to build fast. If you rushed here, it punished you. So they gathered slowly, like dust swept into small pockets of shelter by wind and need. They didn't mark their names in stone. They etched them, sometimes in the soft crust of morning clay prayers, initials, fragments of verses. But by noon, the heat had already smoothed them away. No one minded. The point wasn't to be remembered. The point was to disappear in the right direction. They bathed in silence the way others bathed in water, rarely, and with reverence. When they did speak, it was mostly in murmurs. Sometimes just a single word shared between them at sunset. Peace, or in the morning. Still, that was enough. Meals were taken alone, or with one other if the wind was kind. A crust of barley bread. A few olives, shriveled but stubborn. Once in a while, a blessing oil or figs, brought by a traveler passing through. But they never asked. To ask was to expect. And they were trying to forget what it felt like to want. The days were not tracked by clocks. Time was measured in shadows, in the movement of ants, in the way the stones changed color from morning to night. They slept when the stars came, woke when they left, and they prayed. Not loudly, not with theater, but with repetition the same lines, again and again, until the words became breath, and the breath became silence. A tea wasn't glamorous. Their skin cracked. Their nails broke. They bled when they walked too far, and sometimes they coughed for days when the wind carried sand through the cells. But they endured, not because they were strong, but because they no longer cared if they were weak. The world they'd left behind, the Roman cities with their laws and luxuries, felt like dreams. Too loud, too bright, too full of things that didn't last. Here, they were surrounded by things that lasted too long, stones that would outlive them, silences that had begun before the pyramids. There was no hierarchy. No one was in charge. They followed elder monks, yes, but only because they moved more slowly and knew where the water sat shallow beneath the rocks. You could spend 10 years in the same cell and never know the name of the man beside you. But you would know how he breathed when he slept, how he folded his blanket, how he dipped his fingers in oil before dark. This was knowledge. This was love in its quietest form. They said the angels passed through the desert more often than through cities, because here no one shouted over them. And if an angel did pass brushing the sand from a monk's shoulders, no one would speak of it. Not because it wasn't sacred, but because it was too sacred to disturb. Sometimes a monk would leave, just walk away one day, no note, no farewell, and no one would chase him. You do not hold what you never claimed, and sometimes one would die, his body left in the same straw mat where he had prayed for years, and someone, without speaking, would come and carry him to the place beyond the rocks and lay him down beneath a flat stone. They'd mark the spot with nothing but a small pile of dry twigs. The wind would take those too, but it didn't matter. The man had disappeared, just as he'd hoped to. In a monument. No echo, just silence, a little deeper than it was before. And the others, they would return to their cells, to their bowls, to their murmured prayers, as though nothing had happened, as though the world had not shifted slightly, but in the silence, in the way one man hesitated before kneeling, or how another lit a second lamp that night, you could hear it, the absence, the respect, the continuation. Not everyone disappears in darkness. Some fade in light. And here in the desert, that was enough. They said the desert gave nothing. No wheat, no grapes, no gentle rains. Just sun that pressed you down like a stone, and wind that whispered like a warning. But somehow they survived. And not through miracles, at least. Not the kind anyone would write down. They lived because they learned how to bleed bread from stone, not with knives or prayers, but with stillness, with patience, and with a kind of hunger that made even dry figs taste like offerings from heaven. There were no fields here, no orchards, no vines curling around wooden posts. What food came slowly, carried in on the back of a camel, or cradled in the hand of a traveler who left before morning. Sometimes it was traded for silence. A merchant passing through might sit with a monk for half an hour and speak every word he had saved. The monk would nod, offer him water, and say nothing in return. And when the merchant left, he would leave behind a small sack of lentils, or bread so old it had become hard enough to carve. That was the exchange, story for silence. And both left full in their own way. The bread itself was usually made from barley, coarse, dense, and barely leavened. They would mix it with water fetched from deep, dark wells, water that tasted of minerals and patience. The dough was shaped with palms that had touched very little else, and then flattened on hot stones near the fire, where it blistered, blackened, and cracked like the earth around them. There was no butter, no salt. Sometimes, if the mood struck and the sky had not broken them that week, they would press a single olive into the dough before baking, and it was enough. The bread filled the stomach just enough to sit upright in prayer. Just enough to feel the bones not scrape too sharply against the inside of the skin, but hunger was never far. It walked with them, slept beside them, and kept their prayers sincere. There were days when nothing came. No bread, no oil, no fruit. And they would still sit in their circle at dusk, empty bowls before them, and bow their heads just the same, as if the absence of food was its own kind of offering, as if to say, even now, I give thanks. They fasted not because it was a rule, but because the desert demanded it. And they obeyed the way you obey the sun, not because it's kind, but because you know it doesn't care whether you resist. They did not complain. Complaints were wasted breath, and breath was precious. Instead, they made rituals of the ordinary. When the bread came, it was sliced with a slow reverence, passed hand to hand without a word. No one took the biggest piece. No one reached first. There was an order to it, quiet, unwritten, and always followed. The youngest monks often learned their place not from instruction, but by watching the others. How one elder always gave his portion to the old man whose hands shook. How another always waited until everyone else had eaten before touching his bowl. These small gestures taught more than sermons ever could. There was a kind of dignity in scarcity, a softness in knowing that nothing was owed, that every crust was a gift, not just from the one who baked it, but from the desert itself, which allowed it to be baked at all. Some monks grew gardens, if you could call them that, little patches scraped from the dust, watered with waste and patience, shaded with woven reeds. They grew bitter herbs sometimes, a few roots, enough for one mouth, maybe two, not to feast, just to remember what green looked like. And there were stories, always stories, of bread that never ran out, loaves that multiplied, or manna that drifted down on soft winds. But here, in the desert, those stories felt far away. Beautiful, yes, but not real. What was real was the moment a stranger knocked gently on a sun-bleached door and wordlessly handed over a small cloth bundle, warm with bread, and then vanished. What was real was the small crack in the wall that let just enough light fall onto the flat stone where dough was pressed each morning. What was real was hunger that taught patience, and bread that taught gratitude, and silence that taught both. Sometimes the monks would gather a few at a time and eat together. Not often, but when they did, it was more than food. They would sit in a half circle, backs against the rock, eyes half lidded from sun and prayer. The bread would pass from hand to hand, and they would chew slowly, as if each bite might vanish too quickly if not respected. No one smiled, but no one wept either, because in that moment shared warmth, shared hunger, shared silence, they felt full. Not in body, but in something else. Something deeper. And later, when the fire was down to its final ember and the wind had picked up its evening song, they would lay back on mats of palm and reed, hands resting on their ribs, and sleep without fear, because the bread had come. The silence had held. And that was enough. Not plenty, not luxury, just enough. That was all the desert ever gave, and all they ever asked. There was no linen here, and no fine wool, no flowing white robes like the ones carved on the walls of temples long forgotten. The men of the desert wore their prayers rough spun, sun-stiffened and heavy with dust. These were not garments of beauty, but of endurance. Each thread a small surrender to heat, to labor, to stillness. Their cloaks didn't flow. They clung. They scratched. They blistered. They didn't elevate the wearer. They reminded him of who he wasn't. Itch was a part of life. The coarse. Fabric usually woven from flax or coarse goat hair rubbed raw at the shoulders, pinched at the elbows, and gathered the day's heat like a slow-burning fire. But still they wore them, because they were warm when the desert wasn't, because they hid the bones when food was scarce, because it was what one wore when one had nothing else, and because suffering, however small, could feel like devotion if worn long enough. Most monks had only one cloak, maybe two, if they were lucky or had arrived with worldly things they hadn't yet surrendered. But over time, those extras disappeared, given away to those who arrived barefoot, or bartered for a cracked jug of oil, or simply worn to threads that no longer held. The cloaks were patched with whatever could be found: rope ends, discarded rags, sometimes even parchment scraps from old, crumbling scrolls. One monk had a sleeve mended with the edge of an ancient prayer. Another had sewn in the hem a bit of leather, dyed red once, now sun-faded to a dull memory. Washing was rare. Water was too precious, soap unheard of, and the desert too indifferent to notice the difference. So the cloaks absorbed everything: sweat, sand, smoke from the small fires, and the soft scent of olive oil rubbed on skin at dusk. Some said if you stood close, you could tell a monk's age by the weight of his cloak, how it carried the years. Like a second spine, ash became part of the fabric, too, not by accident, but as a choice. Some monks, in penance or humility, would sit beside the fire each morning and rub ashes into their sleeves, into their collars, into the seams of their tunics, not to clean, but to remind. Ash didn't sting like the sun. It didn't weigh like a full stomach. It simply lingered, a soft gray shadow against the cloth, a reminder that all things return to dust. Even the threads we cling to. Even us. They didn't look like saints. Not in their cloaks. They looked like beggars, like wanderers lost, on the edge of something holy and unnamed. Children would sometimes spot them from far off and think they were ghosts. And maybe, in a way, they were. These garments weren't meant to impress. They were meant to disappear. Into the rock, into the wind, into the quiet shape of a man kneeling with his forehead pressed to stone. Sometimes, if a monk died in the night, which happened more often than anyone spoke of, his cloak would be folded and left beside his body. And another would take it, not in greed, but in honor. To wear what another had worn was to carry him forward, to give his prayer another chance to echo. You didn't boast of it. You simply wore it, like a memory, and let the ash fall where it may. There were no colors here, just shades of brown, gray, ochre, all softened by sun and silence, until the cloaks became the color of the land itself. They blended into the rock, the sand, the sky at dusk. Sometimes one might glimpse a strip of faded blue left over from a past life, or a scrap of embroidery clumsily cut away, still peeking from the inside seam. Little remnants of another world, another identity, but they didn't talk about that. What had been left behind was left behind. The man who wore the cloak now was not the same as the man who had bought it, or earned it, or stolen it, and when night came, and the wind rose sharp against the skin, the cloaks became something else entirely. A wall, a blanket, a shield against the stars that offered no warmth. They would wrap themselves tightly, knees to chest, arms across ribs, and feel the fabric catch every breath, every heartbeat. And in that small cocoon of scratch and ash, they would fall asleep, not to dreams, but to silence. A tea was never comfortable, but it was enough, because it wasn't comfort they came here for. It was surrender. To where the cloak was to wear the truth that life could be hard, that God or silence, or the wind, whatever you called, it wasn't here to clothe you in ease. It was here to strip you down. And then, maybe, to clothe you in peace, one thread at a time. It didn't happen often, but it happened. Sometimes the jar stayed empty for too long. The well didn't rise. The goatskin bag came back dry. And the desert, in its usual way, offered no explanation. No thunder. No cracked sky. No warning. Just silence and thirst. They were used to thirst, of course. It walked beside them like a companion patient ever present. The monks didn't fear it, not exactly. They had learned to sip slowly, to hold water in the mouth like a prayer before swallowing. They counted drops instead of gulps, measured time in swallows, but when the water truly ran out, not low, not scarce, but gone, something in the rhythm of life collapsed. The mornings came dry. Breath turned raspy. Lips cracked before the first prayer. They moved slower there, cloaks dragging more heavily through the dust. And yet they continued. There were no cries, no protests. Only an old quiet, the kind that lives in drought and dust, that settled into the monastery like a second wind. The wells, shallow things carved into ancient rock, had always been fragile. They depended on memory where water had once lived. Sometimes a spring would vanish overnight, swallowed by shifting sand or stone collapse. Other times it would return, months later, as if nothing had happened. But when it didn't, when the well echoed only with the sound of its own emptiness, they waited. They knew that suffering could be short, but endurance, real endurance, was long. Some monks carried water from farther away, half a day's walk through uneven rock and aching heat. They would leave before dawn, cloaks pulled tightly around their heads, and return at dusk with a single jar. Not full, just enough to bless the lips of the sick, to anoint the cracked feet of an elder, to dampen a piece of linen, and press it gently to the neck of a brother who had fainted in the midday glare. They never drank first. That was the rule, spoken or not. The strongest waited, the oldest shared, and the youngest learned by watching. Sometimes they prayed for rain, but not with noise or pleading. The prayers were whispered, wordless at times, drifting into the sky like vapor that wouldn't condense. If it comes, we will thank you. If it doesn't, we will thank you anyway. The roof of the chapel, if one could call the cracked wall and worn beams a chapel, had a basin carved into the stone to catch whatever might fall. Dew mostly, and even then, only in certain months. They watched it carefully in the morning light. One drop could feel like a miracle. And when it formed slowly, shyly, they would hold their breath until it fell. Not to drink, just to see it fall. To know the world still remembered how to give on the worst days. Thirst made the world smaller. They didn't speak, didn't leave their cells. They lay flat, eyes half closed, listening to the sound of nothing, not waiting for death, but not resisting it either. And still, somehow, no one broke. They bent, they hollowed, but they did not crack, because in the desert, survival was not just about holding on. It was about letting go of expectation, of comfort, of the illusion that life owed you anything at all. If water came, they received it with both hands. If it didn't, they gave thanks just the same. Not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they had chosen it, because it was simple. And in that simplicity, there was peace. There are stories whispered from cell to cell over years of one monk who fasted from water for a week, and then another. He did not die. Or if he did, they say, it was not from thirst. It was from fullness a kind no one could see. One morning, a cloud passed overhead, a rare thing, soft and fat and slow. The monks emerged from their cells, their faces lifted, their arms still at their sides. And no one smiled. But hope crept into the corners of their posture, into the way they tilted their heads, into the silence that had suddenly grown tender. A tea did not rain. The cloud drifted on, but for those few minutes, the world felt merciful again. Not generous, but merciful. And later that night, when one monk rose to whisper his evening prayer, he found a puddle small, perfect, unexpected near the base of the chapel wall. Maybe dew, maybe a trick of wind and stone. No one could say. He didn't drink it. He knelt beside it and pressed his fingertips gently into the water, then to his lips, then to his heart. And no words, just gratitude. A ritual made from nothing, and in the end, the water always returned. Eventually. Quietly, a traveler might bring a skin from the river. A cloud might finally burst above the mountain ridge, or the well might rise again, suddenly, as though embarrassed. For its long silence, when it did, the monks did not cheer. They did not dance. They simply filled their jars, washed their faces, sat quietly, and gave thanks, not for abundance, but for enough. And in that, they found what most never do. There are places where words run dry before the water does, where silence isn't a lack, but a form of expression, where the world speaks in wind and grit, and your only task is to listen. The desert is fluent in that kind of language. And the monks, over time, became fluent too. Not in Latin or Coptic or Greek. Those were the tongues of scholars and cities. Here, the dialect was older. Dust, footsteps, breath, the way a robe moved at dawn, the hush of hands lifting bread, the pause before sleep. They had no liturgies carved in gold, no choirs raised in domes. Their speech was slower, less concerned. With meaning than with presence, they communicated like the sand did, softly, insistently, without shape. And if you weren't quiet enough, you missed it entirely. New arrivals often found this the hardest lesson. They would speak too often, too brightly, words spilling out like water from an unstoppered jug. But the desert didn't echo. It swallowed, and so slowly, they learned to say less. And in saying less, to understand more. You could ask a question with a glance, offer forgiveness with the brush of a palm across a clay bowl, say goodnight by placing a second log beside someone's fire. When the wind blew, no one shouted over it. They waited, listened, let it pass. Some monks even said the wind carried messages not from angels or saints, but from each other. That if you listened just right, you could hear what another was feeling, even from a cell 2 hills away. There were gestures, of course, not formal signs, but movements born of rhythm and repetition. A bowed head meant, I am praying with you. A raised brow meant, are you in pain? A fingertip laid gently on a bowl's rim meant, take this. I've already eaten. And when there was nothing left to say, they simply sat, together apart, facing the same horizon, letting the sun speak instead. Speech wasn't forbidden, but it was used with intention. Some monks vowed silence for days, weeks, even lifetimes, not out of pride, but out of reverence. They believed that words, like bread, lost their holiness when offered carelessly. If one did speak, others listened, fully, without reply unless it was truly needed. There was no small talk in the desert. No, how are you? No, what's new, because nothing was ever new. And how you were. Changed too slowly to notice. Occasionally, laughter would break the silence. dry, breathy, like wind catching. In a crack, it startled the birds, but it never lingered long. Humor, when it appeared, was quiet. A shared look when a goat refused to be led. The irony of a pot breaking just after it had been repaired for the third time. A smile exchanged over. A fire that wouldn't light again. Even sarcasm had a place gentle, weathered by the sun. Never biting. Just amused at the absurdity of human effort, but mostly it was silence that shaped them. Not as punishment, but as a mirror. In the quiet, your thoughts had nowhere to hide. Your fears became audible. Your prayers became more honest silence. They believed was the closest thing to truth, because it couldn't lie. It couldn't flatter. It simply waited when storms came sand thick in the air. Visions stripped to inches, they wrapped their cloaks tight and sat down. They didn't call for help, didn't shout warnings. They listened, the sand said. Wait, the wind said. Be still, and in obeying, they survived. They said even the stones had a sound. Not one the ears could catch, but one the body could sense. The hum of warmth stored in granite. The cool breath of morning rising from limestone. The dull groan of age under your feet. You learn to listen with your skin. One monk spent his evenings etching lines in the sand outside his cell circles, waves, small spirals. He said it helped him pray. That watching the lines fade overnight was like being forgiven. Nothing permanent. Nothing held too tightly. Another collected pebbles, each one chosen for its texture. He kept them in a bowl, running his fingers over them in rhythm while meditating. He called it, speaking without voice, his only conversation for 7 years. The desert was not empty. It was quietly full. You had to empty yourself to hear it, and when a monk passed, when a breath didn't rise in the morning, it wasn't announced. There was no bell, just the absence, and even that spoke volumes. In how one man knelt longer, in how another swept the stone steps twice instead of once, in how the silence for a day or two felt just slightly heavier. It wasn't grief in the way the cities knew grief. No weeping, no stories repeated. Around fires, just a stillness that settled over the place like fresh dust. And then, slowly, the language of sand returned. The wind whispered again. The bowls passed hands. The prayers resumed. Soft, rhythmic, wordless, and in that silence, they spoke more clearly than most ever do. Not with eloquence, but with attention, because in the end, they didn't come to be heard. They came to listen, and the desert, though it said little, always had something to say. The rocks outlasted them all, and still they softened. Not from wind, not from water, but from knees each morning, long before the sky turned gold. They would kneel. Same spot, same stone, same prayer. And over the years, that stone ancient, unyielding, began to give, not all at once. Just a faint dip, barely visible at first. Then a groove, then a hollow, until the rock cradled them, as if it had finally learned the shape of devotion. They didn't pray like the temples did. No trumpets, no incense, no raised hands to heaven, just repetition. The same murmured lines, again and again, until they became breath, then rhythm, then silence. Prayer, for them, wasn't performance. It was presence, a way of remaining in the world while also stepping just slightly outside it. Not to escape, but to remember. Some prayers were spoken aloud, just a word, a whisper. Most lived entirely within the chest, moving from heart to mind to lip without ever crossing fully into sound. The words weren't new. They were old, borrowed, passed down like cloaks or bowls. Sometimes just a single sentence repeated at dawn, at dusk, in the aching pause between, "Lord, have mercy, be still, not mine, but yours." Simple phrases worn smooth like river stones. They weren't meant to be understood. They were meant to change the one saying them. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly, like water carving a path, like wind polishing a bone. The prayer stones those little indentations in the earth where knees had knelt for decades were not marked. There were no names, but you could feel something there. A warmth, maybe, or the echo of someone's breath, long gone. They did not pray for things. Not often. Not unless it was for another. They prayed to become empty, to shed the noise, to learn how to be quiet even in the presence of pain, and pain came. In blisters, in hunger, in sickness that hummed quietly through the bones. But the prayers didn't change. They just deepened. There were days when a monk could not kneel, the body too brittle, the joints too swollen. And so he prayed lying down, face to the dirt, palms open, letting the earth carry the words he could. No longer speak. One monk old, hunched, nearly blind, would trace his prayer into the dust each morning with a crooked finger. Same word, every day, until the wind erased it by midday. He never seemed to mind. Another carved his prayer into the wall with the edge of a broken pot, not to be seen, just so he could run his fingers over the letters in the dark. Their cells were small, barely large enough to stretch out in, but each held a corner for prayer, usually facing east, where the light arrived softest. No candles, just the sun, filtered through dust, kissing the stone like a quiet amen. Sometimes, during prayer, one would weep, not loudly, just a tear or two sliding down the cheek without ceremony. Not sorrow, not regret, just release. And when another noticed, he would not speak. He would sit a little closer, breathe a little slower, so that the one weeping wouldn't feel alone. There was no shame in it. To cry during prayer was to be honest, to let the silence ring a little truer. They had no prayer books, no memorized verses carved in gold, just the ones carved in their bones, recited again and again until they no longer needed remembering. They said that, over time, prayer changed shape, that it moved into the hands in the way bread was broken, or a cloak was folded, that eventually even sleep became prayer. Because the heart never stopped repeating what the mouth had once learned to say. When one monk died quietly, as they all hoped to another would take his spot on the prayer stone the next morning. Not because it was required, but because it felt right. The hollow would still be warm, the stone still dusted with the ash of the man who had knelt there the morning before. And when the new knees pressed down, the stone accepted them without question, and so the cycle continued. Stone and skin, prayer and silence, absence and presence. No one ever saw the grooves deepen. You didn't notice it happening. But one day, a monk would look down and realize his knees sat deeper than before, and that the stone had remembered him. And in that moment, without words, he would understand. He had left something behind. Not a mark, not a name, just a shape, an echo, proof that he had once been there, kneeling, breathing, becoming less, and in doing so becoming something more. The desert never slept quietly. It only pretended to. By day, it scorched. By night, it bit. Cold came not as a whisper, but as a presence sudden, absolute, and without mercy. It slipped beneath. Cloaks crept into bones, and gnawed at the edges of sleep like a patient hunger. The monks knew this rhythm well. Heat by light, chill by shadow, and both could kill you, one by flame, the other by silence. When dusk fell, the color drained from the rocks. Gold turned gray. Warmth slipped from the earth like steam rising off a dish now cold. And all that remained was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself. It simply waited until you noticed your hands shaking. So they prepared. Not with firewood, there was little to find, but with habit, layering cloaks, tucking sleeves, drawing their thin mats close to the wall, where the stone still held a bit of memory from the sun. Some slept curled tight, knees pressed to chest like a child in the womb. Others lay flat, arms crossed over ribs as if to hold the warmth inside. And a few simply sat, back straight against the wall, breathing slow, steady, measured as if counting the stars until dawn. There were no beds, just mats of palm reed, thin blankets stitched from cast-off scraps, and the occasional pile of sand, shaped just right to cradle the head. The wind was worse than the cold. It howled some nights, not loud but long, endless, like a cry with no mouth. It snuck through the cracks in the walls, wrapped around ankles, and whispered against the neck like a breath that didn't belong to you. But the monks didn't flinch. They knew this, too, was part of the calling. That discomfort endured long. Enough became a kind of peace, not pleasant but pure. Some lit fires, small ones, careful ones. They used dry dung, thorny branches, or the rare bit of driftwood left behind by a stranger. The flames didn't last, but for a few moments they painted warmth on the stone walls, dancing like memories, too brief to stay. They didn't crowd around them. Instead, they sat at a distance, one to a flame, letting the heat reach them gently, as if not to seem greedy. And when the fire went out, they did not complain. They simply pulled their cloaks tighter and whispered a line of prayer, letting the warmth carry just a little longer in the mind. There was no fear of the dark, only respect, because night in the desert was not empty. It was full of sound, of presence, of weight. Jackals passed sometimes, low and silent. Their eyes glinted like glass caught in moonlight. They didn't howl. They just watched and left. Owls to feathers whispering across the roof, their round faces like coins. In the dark, the monks welcomed them in silence. Some believed they were messengers, eyes for angels too busy to con themselves. And still sleep came. Not easily, but steadily, because exhaustion softens even the hardest ground. And faith, if practiced long enough, becomes its own kind of blanket. Some would fall asleep mid-prayer, the words fading like the last embers in a bowl. Others would lie awake, watching the slow passage of stars through the slits in the wall, time marked by constellations no longer named. And in that stillness, when even the wind paused, the cold would settle deepest into the hands, into the jaw, into the silence between heartbeats. Yet no one stirred. No one cried out, because here, in this life, pain was not the enemy. Comfort was. Comfort dulled the spirit. Cold sharpened it. To suffer the night was to remember the day. To endure the dark was to crave the light. And to wake, teeth chattering and bones stiff, was a triumph. Morning did not arrive, enjoy it. Arrived in smoke and breath, in fingers flexing slowly to life, in the creak of knees against stone. And when they rose, they did so without drama. They folded their mats, rubbed their hands together, lit a new flame if the kindling remained. Then they prayed, sometimes with cracked lips, sometimes with frost still clinging to their cloaks, but always with the same quiet rhythm, because cold did not break them. It refined them, and in time, it taught them a truth, that warmth, given freely, is a gift. But warmth, found after suffering, that is grace, and so they blessed the cold. Not aloud, but in the way they moved, the way they offered a piece of their fire to another, the way they shared a cloak without being asked, the way they smiled barely when the sun returned. Not every desert night ended in sleep, but every one ended in silence. And from that silence they rose again, not stronger, not braver, just still and faithful, and that, in the end, was enough. There wasn't much to own, nor much reason to dot in the desert. Things didn't last, they cracked, they warped, they vanished beneath wind and time. But still, each monk had something, usually just 2 items, a bowl and a spoon. They didn't shine. They weren't carved or painted. They weren't inherited from nobility or given in ceremony. But they mattered. A monk's bowl wasn't just for eating. It was for holding bread, water, ash, silence sometimes, because even emptiness had weight. Most were clay, fired by sun and sand, shaped roughly, never symmetrical. Some wobbled when placed on stone. Some bore hairline cracks along the rim. One had a thumbprint pressed forever into the side, the mark of the hand that shaped it decades earlier, when the monk had first arrived. That was all he had, a bowl, and the time it took to fill it, or wait for it to be filled, and the spoon, if it could be called, that was often nothing more than a carved stick, or a bit of flattened metal, bent into the idea of usefulness. It didn't matter. It stirred. It scraped. It carried, and in that carrying, it became sacred. Meals were not events. They were pauses, quiet ones. You sat on the floor. You held your bowl steady. You didn't rush. When the bread came dry, cracked, barely more than a crust, you broke it into the bowl. When there was lentil broth, you sipped it slowly, letting the warmth kiss your throat. If a date appeared sweet, sticky, rare, you split it in half and offered one piece across the room. No one said thank you. Gratitude was understood. There were no feasts, no gatherings around long tables. Just men, scattered like stones, each in his place, each with his bowl, his spoon, his silence. Sometimes a monk would set his bowl aside, not because he was full, but because someone else wasn't. He would place it beside a sleeping brother, or outside the cell of an elder too ill to walk, and the next day it would be back, washed, not by water, but by wind and care. You could learn everything about a monk by the way he treated his bowl. Some polished theirs with a bit of cloth, smoothed the rim with fingers out of habit, nestled it inside folds of their cloak when not in use. Others left theirs by the door, chipped, dusty, forgotten until needed. Neither way was wrong. But each told a story. A cracked bowl wasn't thrown away. It was mended with wire, with glue made from boiled herbs, with hope. Sometimes the crack leaked. So they learned to tilt, to drink gently. They adapted. There was a kind of poetry in it, the way a bowl taught patience. You could not overfill it. You could not hurry it. You could not take more than it held, and when it was empty, you sat with that emptiness. That, too, was a kind of nourishment. The spoon, often forgotten in stories like these, mattered just as much. It moved slowly through stew. It tapped gently against clay. It never scraped greedily. It waited its turn. A dropped spoon was never cursed, only picked up, brushed off, held a little tighter. One monk carved his into the shape of a leaf. Another tied a bit of string to the handle, a reminder, perhaps, of someone long gone. They never spoke of it. You didn't explain the meaning of your spoon. You just used it. And in that use, it became known, sometimes when a monk died, his bowl was left on the threshold. A quiet sign. No need for words. Someone would pass by. Pick it up, hold it, and then, without speaking, place it back inside the cell. Ready for the next to come, not replaced. Just continued, because life here was not about possession. It was about practice, the practice of simplicity, the practice of waiting, the practice of using the same bowl, day after day, year after year, until the hands that held it no longer trembled, and even then, even in death, the bowl remained, carrying memory, carrying the quiet weight of having been needed. Some might call it poverty. But here, in the desert, it felt like clarity.to. Need only what you could carry in two hands. To eat only what fit in one bowl. To live without wanting more than that, that was enough. And in that simplicity and that worn rim, that dulled spoon, that daily ritual of lifting and swallowing and setting it down again, they found something that others searched lifetimes for: peace, not the peace of full tables and fat cupboards, but the peace of knowing that today you had just what you needed, and that tomorrow might bring the same or not, but either way the bowl would wait. The desert was not sealed. It breathed quietly, and sometimes from far away the world wandered in. They came in ones, sometimes twos, never more. Dust on their shoulders, sweat behind their eyes, carrying stories they didn't yet know they would leave behind. Pilgrims, officials, thieves, lost souls who had followed rumor and wind into the arms of silence. They called it curiosity, or faith, or escape. But what they were really seeking was stillness, and stillness is what they found. The monks did not rise to greet them. No one rushed to open a gate. There was no gate. Visitors simply arrived, slowly, uncertainly, and waited, at the edge of stone and habit, like birds at the edge of a pond, unsure whether to drink or flee. Sometimes they waited for hours before a monk appeared, not to welcome them, just to look, and maybe nod. That nod meant, you may stay, but you will not be entertained. They weren't turned away, but they were not drawn in, because here, in this place, hospitality was not warmth. It was respect. And respect meant space. The visitors asked questions. Of course they did. What do you eat? Why don't you speak? What are you seeking? The monks answered with gestures, with silence, with a bowl of water and a crust of bread. Some visitors stayed the night. Few stayed longer, because the quiet so sacred to the monks was deafening to the unprepared. It pressed in, not rudely, but insistently, until the noise inside a visitor's mind grew louder than anything they'd ever heard before. And for some, that was too much. They left at dawn, their footprints stretching back toward the world like string unraveling. Others stayed longer. A week, a season, a year. Never saying why, they took to the silence slowly. At first, trying to shape it, filling it with whispers or endless prayers or the creak of their own shifting weight, but the desert was patient. And eventually, it taught them how to sit still. One visitor, a young man with a wand, he never spoke of, spent every morning watching ants carry crumbs across a flat rock. By the end of a month, he no longer looked like someone waiting for something. He just looked present. Another, an older woman, rare in that time and place, came seeking answers. She left with fewer questions. That was all. There were dangers too. Not every visitor meant peace. Once, a group of bandits arrived hoping for coins or secrets or hidden stores of food. They found only men too thin to fight, too still to fear. And they left confused, because what power could be stolen from people who owned nothing? Another time, an official came from the city, robes heavy with color, scrolls under his arm. He spoke of taxes, of orders, of structure. No one replied. He returned the next day, and the next, always speaking to no one. On the fourth day, a monk walked past him without a glance and handed him a bowl of figs. Dusty, half-rotted, precious. The man took them, and never returned. The desert changed people. Even the ones just passing through, some left softer, some left shaken, and some didn't leave at all. They stayed. At first, in a borrowed cell, then in silence, then in rhythm, until one day they were no longer visitors, just monks, with cloaks of ash and bowls of clay, with eyes that no longer searched, with voices that no longer needed to be used. No one asked their names. No one needed to. The desert did not care where they had been. It only cared that they stayed, and in staying in sweeping floors, lighting fires, whispering prayers into morning air, they became part of the silence, part of the breathless stillness that had once unnerved them. Not every visitor understood. Not every visitor stayed, but every visitor left changed. Even if they didn't know it yet, because once you've heard the desert speak not with sound, but with stillness, you carry that voice with you. Soft, persistent, like sand in your shoes long after the journey's done, and sometimes years later, when the world is loud again, and comfort feels like noise, and rest never truly comes. You remember the way silence once wrapped around you, cool, unyielding, kind, and you wonder, what would happen if you listened again? Most creatures left. They smelled the quiet, felt the stillness, and knew it wasn't meant for them. The heat cracked their paws. The stones offered no shade. The silence that strange, humming absence made them uneasy, but a few remained. Not many, not loudly, just there, and over time, they too became part of the desert's rhythm. Goats were first, brought by the early monks, tethered with fraying rope and hopeful eyes. Some wandered off after a day, drawn toward greener things that never arrived. Others stayed, huddling near the walls at night, chewing with the soft indifference of survival. Their milk was thin, their bleats dry as wind. But they endured, and in enduring, became holy in their own quiet way. Monks learned to whisper to them, not words, tones, low hums, gentle clicks of the tongue, the press of a palm against a rough forehead, enough to say, "You're safe. I see you. We're still here." Donkeys came next, stubborn, patient, too tired to rebel. They carried wood, water, silence, never in haste. They didn't flinch at prayers or wind. They simply stood, unmoved, as the sun melted the horizon into fire. Then, without instruction, they moved again. There were lizards, small ones, scaled, like ancient armor, darting through cracks and under stones. Quick, cautious, untouchable. They kept their distance, but they watched. Some monks swore the same one returned each day, perched on the same rock, blinking with slow amusement. A tiny witness to their habits. Scorpions, too hidden, brooding. Not feared, just respected. A presence you didn't disturb. A reminder that not all silence was gentle. And at night, the desert woke. Bats stitched the sky in loose threads, wings fluttering like cloaks in the wind. Owls silent, perfect, floated overhead, their eyes wide as moons. One owl made its nest above the chapel's crumbling arch. It stayed for years, never cried out, just watched. The monks began leaving scraps, bits of bread, dried fruit, the rind of a fig on the ledge below. They never saw it eat. But the food disappeared, and the owl remained. It became a kind of guardian, not of people, but of peace. Once, a snake slithered into a monk's cell. He didn't kill it. He didn't flee. He simply opened the door. The snake paused, tongue tasting the silence, then slid back out. That was the rule here. You didn't harm what didn't harm you. You didn't fear what didn't chase you. Everything was allowed to exist. Quietly, insects buzzed low. Through the twilight, soft halos of sound around the few lamps they dared light. Monks would watch them, the way their wings shimmered, the way their movement mirrored thought, fast, erratic, untethered. Some monks whispered their prayers to the bees rare as they were imagining their wings carrying blessings from cell to cell, flower to God, and back again. Cats dusty, lean, half wild began appearing one year. No one knew where from, but they came. They slept on cloaks, walked the walls, curled beside fire embers, eyes reflecting every flicker. They purred, but only for certain monks. As if sensing which hearts had emptied just enough to make room for them, one cat was buried in the sand, with the same care as a brother. No stone, just a circle drawn with the end of a spoon, and a prayer that no one spoke aloud. The animals who stayed didn't serve. They didn't work. They didn't offer wool or meat or milk. They offered presence. They were reminders of another kind of faith, the kind that doesn't kneel, doesn't chant, doesn't seek salvation, just exists, still, soft, true. Their days were simple. Drink from the basin, sleep in the shade, listen, and in that simplicity, the monks saw something familiar. A mirror, a kinship, because they too had stripped life down to its bones, had chosen stillness, had chosen to stay. The world thought holiness were robes and sang songs. But here, in this brittle place where the sun forgot to be kind, holiness had fur and wings and claws, and it moved silently through the dust. When a monk died, sometimes a dog not theirs, just a wanderer would appear, sit near the body, wait, and leave before dawn. No howling, no digging, just presence, and the monks would say nothing. But later that night, they would place a piece of bread beside the outer wall, and they would whisper a line of prayer meant for all who remained. Without needing to, not every soul had two legs. Not every prayer came from a mouth, and not every silence was empty. Some carried paw prints, feathers, the soft, warm breath of something wild. And watching, the heat did not ask permission. It came each morning steady, unsmiling, and pressed its hand across every surface. The stones warmed early, then burned. The clay walls began to sigh, and the bodies, already thin, already quiet, began to feel something unravel. Illness was not an event here. It was a presence. Low and quiet, like smoke that never thickened, like a fevered dream that never woke. There were no doctors, no medicine jars, no aloes or oils or silver spoons of honey. There was only time and attention. They knew the signs. The eyes that blinked too slowly, the breath that came short, then long, then vanished into the ribs. The way someone sat in the shade just a little too long, not praying, just still. A tea first. No one spoke. Silence was the rule, even with sickness. But then a bowl would appear, water, maybe cool, left just inside the cell. A folded cloak placed at the feet. A gentle knock. Not to enter, just to say, I see you. They didn't believe in interrupting God's work, but they did believe in watching over his servants, and so they cared without noise, without trauma. One monk would sit near the sick, not touching, not asking, just being, breathing beside them, letting their breaths fall into rhythm. They called it shared suffering, not to carry the pain, but to recognize it, to say, "You're not alone in this fire." Fever came often, not because of contagion, but because the body in such thin margins had no room for error. One skipped meal, one cracked foot, one bad night, and the balance shifted, and heat rushed in to finish the work. The monks didn't fight it. They welcomed it like an old adversary, familiar, persistent, oddly faithful. Cold cloths were rare, but offered when they could. Water dripped slowly onto lips. A hand, usually rough, calloused, rested against a brow, offering no cure. Only presence, and in that presence, healing sometimes began, not of the body, but of the fear that came with weakness, because here, weakness was not shameful. It was a teacher, one that spoke slowly, in pain and dizziness, in limbs that refused to lift, and the lesson was always the same. You are not in control, but you are still loved. When a monk began to fail, truly fail, when the heat no longer felt outside, but within, the others gathered quietly. 3, maybe 4. They didn't hold hands. They didn't chant. They just sat at the edges of the room, letting their silence fill the space where medicine could not. One might hum a low note, barely a sound. Another might light a small fire, not for warmth, but for the scent. The smoke curled gently toward the ceiling, as if offering the moment upward, and when the monk slept deep, shallow, uncertain sleep, someone would wash his bowl, not out of necessity, but out of hope. Sometimes they recovered. The fever broke. The breath returned. And with it, the soft ritual of daily life resumed, one step at a time, one prayer, one spoonful. But sometimes they didn't. Death here was not loud. It came in the same way life did, slowly, gently. Wrapped in dust, the others would not weep. Not because they weren't sad, but because sadness did not need to be proven. Instead, they would carry the body. Not far, just to the place beyond the rocks. The same place as before. The same silence. The same earth. The grave was shallow. The shroud simple, his own cloak. The prayer, if spoken, was soft. Rest. Return. Remember. And then, back they went, not out of coldness, out of rhythm, because here, death was a comma, not an ending. A breath between prayers, the cell would be swept, the bowl placed back, the mat folded, and life would resume. Not unchanged, but undisturbed, because even in death, the silence remained. And the silence was sacred. Sometimes, weeks later, a new monk would arrive. He would be given the same cell, the same bowl, the same place where another had once knelt, once suffered, once passed on. And one told him. He didn't need to know. The room remembered. That was enough. Illness in this place was not a punishment. It was a passage. Through heat, through weakness, through surrender. And in that surrender, they believed there was something holy, because when the body failed and the voice cracked and all that was left was breath, that's when prayer became purest. Most days, no one arrived. And even when they did, they rarely brought news. The desert wasn't a place for messages. It was a place for forgetting what you'd hoped to hear. But sometimes, rarely, a letter would come, folded parchment, faint ink, edges curled from heat, corners smudged by hands that had carried it across months of road and wind. It arrived not like news, but like memory. And it was read as such, slowly, softly, as though the voice of the sender still clung to the paper. Monks didn't expect mail. Most had not spoken their names aloud in years, but the world, in its slow, stubborn way, still remembered them, a brother from a far monastery, a friend from a former life, a sister whose heart ached across oceans of silence. Some were written by trembling hands, others by scribes, paid in bread or coins. To carry someone's words into the emptiness, the letters took years to arrive. Quite literally, a message sent in spring might not reach the desert until the monk's beard had grayed, until the room it was meant for had been swept clean and given to someone new, and still it was opened, held gently. Read aloud not for the one it was addressed to, but for the wind, the walls, the sky, because words once sent deserved to be heard, even if the ears they were meant for had long stopped listening. There was no rush. Letters were sacred, not because they held information, but because they held intention. I think of you when the wheat turns gold. Mother has passed, but she smiled when we spoke of you. Do you remember the fig tree by the well? No one asked for advice. No one gave it. They simply shared the weather of their hearts, and when the letter was finished, it was folded. Again, not stored, not hidden. Often, it was placed beneath a stone, or pressed into the seam between two bricks. Left where time could claim it slowly, monks rarely replied. Not because they didn't care, but because their lives had become too quiet for paper. They believed presence was the answer to all questions, and yet, occasionally one would write back. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, a small brush, ink mixed with oil, parchment laid flat against a wooden board. The light from a slit in the wall catching each word as it formed, the letter would be short, but not empty. The figs are late this year, I remember her eyes. The silence is kind to me, and then it would be sent, tied with twine, given to a traveler who might find his way back toward the city. And no guarantee, no return address, just trust that if the message was meant to arrive, it would. There were monks who kept old letters folded tight, hidden beneath mats or cloaks. They would take them out sometimes, not to read, just to hold, as if the paper still carried the warmth of a distant hand. One monk had only one letter. He read it once each year on the same day. He never said why, and no one asked. Another found a letter not addressed to him, left in a cell long emptied. He read it anyway, then copied it in full by memory onto the wall of his own room. The original he buried under a fig tree, which never bore fruit again, but never died either. Some monks couldn't read, and so the others read aloud soft, even, with pauses, letting each word settle like dust on stone. It didn't matter what the letter said. What mattered was that someone had remembered, had reached across miles and years and silence to say, you're still known, you're not forgotten. You were once loved, and that still matters. There is a holiness in that kind of remembering, a faith not in outcome, but in effort, in writing something that may never be read, in waiting for an answer that may never come, and choosing to do it anyway. That, too, is a kind of prayer, not made with words repeated, but words released, given, sent, set free into a world that may never return them, and sometimes when the wind was just right, when the evening sunlit, the walls in soft gold, you could almost hear the letters still being carried across dunes, across silence, across time. They never knew his name, or if they did, they forgot it the way you forget the shape of a shadow after staring too long into light. He came in the spring, they said, though no one was keeping count. Just appeared one morning, barefoot and thin, standing near the outer wall with dust in his eyelashes and something unreadable behind his eyes. He did not speak, not once, not a greeting, not a prayer, not even a name whispered at dusk when no one was listening. Some assumed it was a vow of silence chosen, offered like a coin at the foot of a statue. Others believed it was older than that maybe he had never spoken at all either. They welcomed him, in their way, which is to say they left him alone. He was given a cell, small, empty, but it took him only an afternoon to make it feel like someone belonged there. He swept the floor with a bundle of reeds. He placed a flat stone where the sun reached at midday. He stacked his bowl and spoon mismatched, chipped, and then sat. He sat for hours, unmoving, breathing as if trying not to disturb the air around him. He listened more than the others, though not with his ears, with his presence, as if he heard with his whole body the wind, the prayers, the breath of a goat on the other side of the wall. And the silence deepened. He aged quietly. His movement slowed. His gaze softened. But his silence held. Some wondered what his voice might sound like. High or low, rough or smooth. Would it tremble? But no one asked, because by then they understood. The silence was the voice, and one morning his door stayed shut, longer than usual. No smoke from his fire, no footfall near the well. They found him sitting upright, hands folded, head bowed. Still, his bowl was clean, his cloak folded beside him. A sprig of dry lavender rested on the ledge, placed by no one. Or perhaps, placed by time itself. They buried him in silence. Of course, no marker. No words spoken. But in the days that followed, something changed. Monks began pausing before they spoke, gesturing more, rushing less. They swept the path outside his cell with a little more care, left bread for the animals, even when there was little for themselves, sat longer by the fire, saying nothing, and without meaning to, without deciding till they had begun to speak his language, a language without verbs, without questions, without ends, a language made of breath and gesture and stillness. Years later, when the wind shifted and new travelers arrived, they'd sometimes ask about the quiet when the monk who never spoke, and the others would smile, just slightly, then bow their heads and say nothing, because some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be felt, like the hush of dusk, or the warmth of a hand, or a man who said more by saying nothing at all. Time does not preserve the desert. It grinds it, gently, slowly, until even the stones forget their shapes, until walls lean without falling, until the past becomes not ruins, but suggestion. What remains of the monastery is not what it was, not fully a low arch where a chapel used to be, a half room with no roof, the vague outline of sleeping cells etched into the dust like memories that never solidified. No doors, no bells, just silence thick enough to feel, and wind, always wind, sifting through the stones, lifting the sand, brushing across what once was prayer and breath and bowl and shadow. The place speaks, still, but only in fragments. A sliver of carved wood beneath a dune, a bit of blackened stone, once fire-touched, a rusted hinge orphaned by time. The walls hum faintly if you place your palm against them, not with sound, with story. You can feel the warmth of hands that once rested there, the weight of men who leaned after long days, the quiet sigh of someone pausing in the sun's last light. Dust settles where the voices once rose, not in volume but in prayer, murmured, repeated, faded like chalk left in rain. And when you step inside what's left of a cell, you can still feel it, not a ghost, but a presence. Asks if the silence remembers how someone once folded his cloak here, knelt here, wept here, waited here. The air thickens, not with fear, but with reverence. You walk softer, breathe quieter, not out of superstition, but out of respect, because the dust has learned more than the books.it has listened to every moment, every step, every breath that once filled these rooms like smoke, like incense, like whispered surrender, and now it holds them, all of them. The chapel is open to the sky, its corners worn down. A bird nests in what used to be the upper beam, and when the wind passes through the space, it carries with it a hush that feels like music without notes. If you sit there long enough, and the sun lowers just right, the floor warms beneath you, not from light, but from memory, as if the stones still remember the knees that once bent here. And then the wind pauses, and you hear it, not voices, not chants, just echoes of lives that once moved slowly, breathed quietly, and said little, a fragment of prayer maybe, or the scrape of a spoon across clay, or the sound of a breath caught between pain and peace. They do not haunt. They do not cling. They echo softly like footsteps fading over sand. There are carvings, faint and shallow, lines etched into walls now rounded by sun and wind. A cross, a name, a series of dots that might have once been a calendar, or maybe just a way to count the days a man stayed still. And one knows there are no signs, no plaques, just questions you don't ask aloud. Who slept here? Who died here? Who left? And who didn't? And yet, no one feels lost. Even the ruins feel held by the sky, by the stone, by the silence. As if time itself decided not to erase, but to soften. You notice odd things. A groove in the stone near the chapel wall, worn by knees or hands, or years of leaning. A row of holes in the rock that might have held a shelf, now gone. A bit of broken pottery tucked carefully in a corner, not discarded, but placed. You find yourself whispering, even when alone. Especially when alone, because this place, even broken, still listens, still holds space for the slow, the quiet, the sacred. There's no storybook ending here. No marble tomb. No legend etched in stone. Just dust that rises and settles. Wind that moves through what remains. And silence that somehow speaks, not of what was lost, but of what was lived. This is how the desert remembers, not with monuments, but with presence, the echo of someone waking before dawn, the memory of bread being broken in half, the sound of someone coughing once, then never again, all of it. Held here, gently, patiently. So that even if no one ever returns, even if the last wall finally crumbles, the place will still know that once, in a time without names, men came here to be silent, and in doing so, were heard. It was just another morning, the kind where the wind rose slowly, stretching across the sand before the light had fully arrived. The kind where silence wasn't unusual, just expected. No one said it, but they all knew there would be no bread today. The bowls were out, as always, set on the ledge, waiting. A habit more than a hope. Some part of them still honoring the rhythm, even when the rhythm broke. The man who usually brought the flour hadn't come. No footsteps down the narrow ridge. No cloud of dust in the distance. No faint creak of the cart or tired cough of the mule. Gone, and so they sat. Not in panic, not even in sadness. Just in awareness, because when you live with little, you don't fear having nothing. You already know its shape. They drank water, what was left of it, held it in the mouth longer than usual, swallowed carefully, as if asking permission. Some monks didn't move from their cells. They lay flat, saving energy, waiting for the hunger to pass or deepen. Sometimes it passed. Sometimes it stayed. The air felt heavier than usual. Not hotter, just slower. The fire wasn't lit. There was nothing to warm. The stone stayed cold beneath their hands, and yet no one complained, not aloud, not in gesture. There was nothing. To say that the wind hadn't already whispered, not today. The ones who could worked, sweeping, mending, gathering kindling with no plan for it. The hands must move. Even when the stomach stills, one monk offered his last date to another. Just placed it beside the bowl and left. Another monk, seeing the offering, split it in half again and passed it on. In words. Just the silent understanding that kindness was more nourishing than fruit. That afternoon, a stranger appeared, sunburned, dry-eyed, carrying nothing. He asked for bread. The monk who met him didn't laugh, didn't explain. He simply handed him a cup of water, bowed his head, and returned to his work. The man sat, drank slowly, and stayed until sunset, then left, taking nothing, leaving nothing. The evening prayers were softer that night, not fewer, just thinner. Like a thread pulled taut, one monk hummed a sound without melody, just vibration as he watched the horizon darken. It wasn't sadness. Not quite. It was something else. The awareness that even faith has hunger. Even silence needs to be fed, but the monks did not beg. They did not pray louder. They did not look to the sky for rescue. Instead, they folded their cloaks a little tighter, laid their heads down a little earlier, and let their bodies speak the language of absence. That night, the wind was sharp, not cruel, just honest. It pulled at the edges of the cells, lifted corners of cloth, danced over empty bowls, and in the cold, the monks huddled a little closer to the walls, pressed their palms against their ribs, not to keep something in, but to remember what it felt like when something was there. They slept in pieces, briefly, restlessly, waking at odd hours to the feeling of something missing, not food exactly, but a rhythm and still. They gave thanks. In the dark, you could hear it, not aloud, but in the breath, in the quiet exhale before sleep. The kind that says, I do not need to be full to be faithful. At dawn, a small sound, a bell, rusty, faint. The flower man had returned, dust-covered, apologetic in posture, not words. He had been delayed by a washed-out road, a sick animal, the slowness of life outside the silence. And no one asked, no one scolded. They simply helped him unload, and when the dough was made flour, water, a touch of ash, it was baked without ceremony. The bread cracked in familiar ways, rough at the edges, dense in the middle, but that morning it tasted different. Not sweeter, just deeper, because they had remembered what it meant to miss it. To crave it, to go without, and in that remembering, the bread became something more, not a habit, a gift. They ate slowly, gratefully, and in silence that felt warmer than usual. The bowls were washed with care, the crumbs brushed into the wind, and the monks returned to their cells with the kind of peace that hunger teaches, the peace of knowing that the world does not always give, and that sometimes it gives again just when you've learned how to live without. And the desert watched. As it always had, unmoved, unimpressed, but maybe just a little softened. It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed hesitant. No moon, no breeze, just the dense stillness of a desert holding its breath. And then, suddenly, a glow, low, steady, unfamiliar, far across the ridge, just over the rise where the land forgets to rise any further. There it was, a fire, not theirs, not small, not safe. It pulsed in the dark like an unanswered question. Orange and strange, too large for cooking, too still for movement, the monks noticed. Not all at once, but like moths drawn to a soundless hum. One by one, they stepped into the open air and looked. No one pointed. No one asked. They just stood cloaked, quiet, watching something that did not belong. The fire burned without flicker. It didn't sway in the wind. It didn't crackle loud enough to reach them. It simply glowed, a presence more than a blaze. It could have been anything. A caravan stopped for the night. A group of soldiers lost or searching. A band of wanderers warming their fear, but it didn't move. And that was what unsettled them. In the desert, movement is life. Stillness at the wrong distance feels like a warning. The monks didn't panic. They didn't prepare defenses. There were no defenses to prepare. They simply watched. Some sat on the low wall that bordered the southern edge of the ruins. Others remained in their doorways, hands tucked into sleeves, breath slow and invisible. One monk began to hum not a song, but a note. Low, steady, like a thread between himself and the glow beyond. Another monk lit a small fire of his own. Not in defiance, not to compete, just to say, we are here too. That night, few slept. Not out of fear. Out of awareness, the fire in the distance reminded them of what they had left behind, the noise of men, the hunger for control, the warmth that comes not from surrender, but from conquest. A tea might have been harmless. It might have been holy. They would never know, because by morning, it was gone. And no smoke, no tracks, no echo. The sand, faithful as ever, had swallowed whatever story it once held, and so they resumed. The bowls were filled. The cloaks were folded. The silence returned, as if nothing had happened, but something had. Not an attack, not a message, just a flicker, a reminder that the world still burned beyond the stones. That danger or desire or desperation still roamed, even if only occasionally, across the edge of their peace. That fire, however distant, always comes with a choice. You can chase it, or you can let it pass. The monks had chosen long ago. They had chosen the cold, the dark, the soft breath of prayer over the bright noise of flame. But still, they watched, because fire has a way of staring back, even when it says nothing. That morning, when the sun rose soft and pale, a monk returned to the wall where he had stood the night before. He sat, closed his eyes, and let the warmth settle over his face. Not fire this time, just light. And in that warmth, he whispered something. Only once, only to himself, and then he was silent again. No one asked what he said. No one needed to, because the fire, though gone, had left something behind. Not fear, not damage, awareness that peace is not the absence of danger. It is the decision to face it, without moving. To know the fire is out there, and still remain. The desert didn't smell like nothing. It smelled like memory, not sharp, not sweet, but dry, worn, slow. It smelled like time moving gently through cloth and clay, like the breath of old stones after heat, like things that had lived long enough to forget their names. The monks knew these smells as well as they knew silence. Sometimes better. Dust was the most constant. It clung to everything, to cloaks, to skin, to spoons and sandals, and the threads between a man's fingers. It had no urgency, no scent of warning, just the dull, earthy presence of something that had seen too much and still chose to stay. Dust was not an enemy. It was insulation, a quiet layer between the world and the flesh. It softened harshness, muted sounds, wrapped the days in its pale, patient haze. Then there was oil, not the kind used in temples. Not perfume, not luxury. Just pressed olive oil, cloudy, golden, sacred in its simplicity. It smelled like care, like hands rubbed together before sleep, like a wound tended in silence, like the moment before a flame was lit. Each monk had a small jar, if they were lucky, a little lid of cork or cloth, tied with string or faith. They used it sparingly. A dab on cracked lips, a drop on raw heels. Sometimes they'd soak a wick in it and set it to glow for prayer when a lamp was lit. The room warmed not in temperature, but in feeling. The smell of oil and flame made the cell feel less like stone, and more like shelter. You could trace a monk's stay by scent. Morning was clay and cold air. Midday brought sweat not sour, but clean, like salt dried on sun-warmed skin. Evening was oil and sometimes smoke, if the fire had behaved, and through it all, dust. A constant companion. Soft, patient, faithful. They said that grief had a smell. And in the desert, it did. It smelled like ash on a tunic sleeve, like bread burned at the edge because someone forgot to watch the fire, like a cell left untouched for too long, the air still carrying the absence of someone who had stopped breathing weeks before. But joy, too, had a scent. It was faint, harder to find. But real. It came in the form of ripe dates, brought from a traveler 3 days late, or the rare fragrance of crushed mint from a garden someone had coaxed into living behind a wall of sun-bleached stone. Joy smelled like soap. Once, when a visiting monk from a monastery far upriver gifted a sliver wrapped in linen, the monks took turns holding it, not to use, just to know. One pressed it to his cheek. Another placed it near his mat for a single night. Then, like a relic, it disappeared into a cell, to be remembered, not consumed. Some monks rubbed rosemary on their wrists. Not often. Just enough to feel human. Others placed dry flowers in corners, brittle, scentless, but powerful in memory. The chapel held its own fragrance. Worn wood, warmed stone, and the lingering trace of generations of prayer, something sweet, but solemn. When a monk died, his cell was left closed for 3 days. Not out of rule, out of respect. When it was opened again, the scent hit first. Not foul, just full of old oil, old breath, old fire. It wasn't unpleasant. It was human. They cleaned slowly, swept gently, opened the walls to the wind and let it do what it did best, carry memory forward without making a sound. And then, when the scent faded, another arrived. Not to replace, just to begin again. The smell of oil and dust greeted him like a welcome he hadn't known to expect. And just like that, the cell lived again. Sometimes the scent of rain would come. Not rain itself, just the hint. A trembling in the air. A change in the way the dust settled. A moment when the nose remembered. Water it hadn't tasted in months. They would step outside. Not hopeful. Not desperate. Just attentive. And if the rain never came, they still carried the scent of it in their lungs for a little while longer. In a place where vision could deceive, where the heat shimmered and the sand shifted and nothing stayed in place. Scent became something true. It didn't lie, didn't exaggerate. It simply was proof that something had been there. Oil, dust, ash, bread, breath. They didn't perfume their lives. They let the air carry what it would. They lived with it, in it, as part of it, because holiness didn't always smell like incense. Sometimes it smelled like work, like fatigue, like skin warmed by sun, cloaked in linen, and resting finally in the quiet end of day, and when the wind picked up and moved softly through the cells, it carried with it every scent they had ever made, and left just enough behind to remember. There are no heirlooms in the desert. Nothing polished. Nothing saved for show. But sometimes a cloak remained, and when it did, it carried more than dust. The monk had worn it for years. Nobody knew how many. It had faded from black to brown to something the wind itself might wear. Colorless, weightless, soft from use. He was old, but quiet about it. His steps slow, not because he was fragile, but because he took only as much space as he needed. He folded his cloak each night like a ritual. 2 folds lengthwise, 1 across, pressed flat by hand, set beside his bowl. Always the same place, always the same care. When he passed gently, in the early part of a windless morning, no words were spoken. There was no procession, no ceremony, only stillness. They laid him in the earth with his mat beneath him, but not the cloak. That he had left folded, intentionally perhaps. Waiting for hours, it sat there untouched. Then one of the younger monks, not young by the world's standards, but young by desert time, stepped forward. He didn't ask, didn't look around. He knelt, lifted it, pressed his face into the fabric, not to smell, to remember, to feel what still lingered in the threads. He wrapped it around his shoulders. It fit loosely, hung low, and in that moment, he became someone different. Not him, not the old monk, but someone shaped slightly by his absence, by the cloth he left behind. A cloak here wasn't just warmth, it was memory. Protection not only from the cold, but from forgetting. This one bore the marks of time. A small tear at the hem, mended into different threads. A faint oil stain near the collar olive, not perfumed. A corner that had been singed, maybe by fire, maybe by candlelight. Each imperfection was part of the story. Wearing it was not an act of vanity. It was an act of prayer. Every morning, when the young monk draped it over his shoulders, he remembered who had come before. Not by name, not by story, but by silence, and silence is the most faithful kind of remembering. Others noticed. No one commented, but when they passed him, they touched his arm a little longer, met his eyes a little slower, as if something of the old man still stood there, wrapped in quiet. He wore it through winter, through illness, through nights where the stars blinked cold and the wind rattled the clay walls like breath against an old chest. And then, one day, he too folded it, 2 folds lengthwise, 1 across, pressed flat by hand, and left it at the foot of his mat. He wasn't sick. He hadn't spoken of going, but he had, in his own way, passed the cloak on. No words, no offering, just the quiet return of something that had carried him. Another monk, this one slower, more weathered, with hands that trembled only slightly, picked it up, and so it continued. 1 cloak, many shoulders, each bearing it differently, each honoring it with use, not reverence. Over time, the cloak lost shape. The thread thinned. 1 sleeve gave way. The seams pulled, and when it could no longer be worn, not without unraveling, they didn't burn it. They laid it flat beneath the chapel wall, pressed it into the sand, and covered it gently with palm reeds and stone. It was not buried, just returned, and the place where it lay became sacred in the quiet way things become sacred when no one speaks of them. Later, when a monk passed that corner, he would pause, not long, not in mourning, just a breath, a memory shared through fabric, through time, through warmth carried across shoulders bowed by prayer. The desert has no heirlooms, but it remembers what is worn, and in that remembering, Nothing is ever truly lost. Time, in the desert, was not kept. It was felt. There were no bells, no hourglasses, no bronze instruments carefully aligned to the sun. The monks didn't measure time. They moved through it like water through fingers, aware, but unburdened. And above them, always, the sky. Their only clock dotted T-night. The stars came alive not with noise, but with meaning. They glittered not to impress, but to guide. The monks watched them the way others watched flames. Softly, steadily, without urgency. They knew which stars meant midnight, which ones meant it was time to begin prayer, which ones faded just before the pale hush of dawn. Orion's belt, low in the east, meant rest was ending. The dim curl of the Pleiades meant the long middle watch. And when Venus rose like a bright whisper over the dunes, it was time to stand, to breathe, to pray. They didn't chart the stars with ink. They charted them with attention. One monk carved a small notch in the wall each time a full moon passed. Not to count, just to witness. Another would lay stones in a circle, one for each visible planet. He'd sit in its center and wait for light to shift, for shadows to stretch, for silence to change shape. The sky told them everything: when to gather water, when to fast, when the seasons had shifted. Though the land gave no signs, a longer dusk meant cooler nights ahead. A shorter twilight meant the heat would return with its sharp white teeth. Some monks said the stars spoke, not with words, but with presence, that their positions were not just coordinates, but questions. Are you still here? Have you forgotten? Do you remember how small you are, and how sacred? They answered not with speech, but with breath. One inhale under Orion, one exhale as the moon began to rise. Prayer by starlight required no books, only necks unburdened by crowns, only hearts soft enough to feel rhythm instead of rule, on nights when the wind was still and no one stirred. You could lie on your mat, stare upward, and feel time stop, not pause. Stop.as if eternity had bent low, just for a moment, to kiss the brow of the quiet. The stars did not demand. They invited. They did not change for you. They simply waited for you to notice, and the monks noticed every night. Someone was awake, always, watching the sky, not guarding, just keeping company. Sometimes two monks would meet without planning, their cells empty, their footsteps converging on the outer wall. They wouldn't speak. They'd just sit side by side and trace the constellations with their eyes, the way a child might trace the lines of an old face. With reverence, with memory. Time, then, was a shared silence. They marked the watches of the night, not by chimes, but by starlight. Each monk had a sense for when to wake the next. A gentle touch, a whispered breath, and then sleep again. The cycle continued, not enforced, but honored. The body adjusted. The soul remembered. When someone died, their final hours were often spent beneath the stars, not by design, by instinct. As if, in letting go, the soul needed one last glance at the heavens, one last reassurance. You were small, yes, but you mattered. And when that breath was gone, someone always looked up to find the star that would carry it. They believed some stars were born of men, that every holy life left behind a flicker, not to be named, but to be known. And that, in the great sky above the desert, there were more monks than stars. Time moved slowly here, but not aimlessly. Each breath was a moment, each prayer a passing, each night a long unfolding. When the sun finally returned, it didn't rush them. It peeled away the sky's mystery gently, like fingers unwrapping linen from a face. And the monks stood, not to begin a new day, but to continue a rhythm already older than words, the stars disappeared. But not forgotten, because even when unseen, they remained faithful, bright. Watching, like the monks themselves, he wasn't expected. But then again, no one ever was. He arrived at mid-morning, the sun already bright enough to flatten shadows. His robe was too clean, his sandals too new, and his eyes they didn't scan. They searched. He stood just beyond the first cluster of stones where the silence began to thicken, and waited. No one greeted him. No one asked why he'd come, but when someone passed by with a clay jar, they placed it on the ground near him. Water, still cool from the well. He sat, drank, stayed. That was how it began. At first, he lingered on the edge, near the outer wall, as if unsure whether he had truly arrived, or if the desert had simply paused long enough for him to catch up. He didn't speak for 2 days. Not because he had taken a vow, but because silence seemed to demand it. Even the goats had stopped their bleating when he came near, as if sensing the noise he carried inside. On the 3rd day, someone offered him a bowl. He ate slowly, not hungrily, cautiously, as if every bite might carry a question. Be why the end of the week. He had a place to sleep, not a cell, just a bit of shade beneath a broken wall. And that was enough. He didn't ask to stay. He simply didn't leave. No one asked about his life before, what had driven him here, what he'd left behind. That was the rule, spoken not in words, but in kindness. The past was respected, but not revived. Still, stories carry in posture, and his was the kind that slouched slightly, even when kneeling. The kind of weariness that didn't come from labor, but from being too needed for too long. His hands were skilled. He repaired the cracked cistern near the chapel, straightened a wall that had been leaning since the last rains. He swept not just the stones, but the spaces between them. And when the firewood pile grew low, he gathered more without being asked. By the end of the first season, they no longer called him a stranger, not because he was known, but because he no longer seemed new. He learned the rhythm, when to wake, when to walk, when to let hunger speak before the mouth ever did. He never spoke of prayer, but he watched the stars longer than most. And in the mornings, before the sun crested the ridge, he was already sitting, hands in his lap, eyes half closed, breath steady. He laughed once, softly, when a goat stepped into the well basin and refused to leave. The laugh surprised even him. It came out dry, but bright, as if something long buried had stirred just beneath the ribs. The others didn't laugh, but one smiled, and that was enough. He asked one question only once, to an older monk who was pressing oil into a lamp. What happens if I stay forever? The monk didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he handed the younger man the lamp. Still warm, still glowing. Then keep this lit, his eyes seemed to say, and walked away. He did, for days, for weeks, for years. Eventually, his cell was built not for him, but because the space wanted it. The stones, when stacked by his hand, settled easily, as if the land, too, had decided he belonged. He stopped counting days, stopped waiting for clarity. The questions faded, not answered, just no longer necessary. The city he'd come from blurred in memory, not forgotten, but softened, like a dream you wake from with kindness, but no desire to return. The fire inside him, that restlessness, that noise grew quiet, not extinguished, just calm. And one evening, when the wind blew cooler than expected, he took off his cloak and placed it over an elder asleep by the chapel wall. He didn't shiver. He just sat closer to the fire and watched the stars. Years later, long after the man who once arrived had become someone new, a traveler came, dust-covered, lost. Searching for silence, he asked if this was the place. The monastery. The one where men vanished to find themselves. The monk who met him nodded and said nothing, but later that night, as the fire burned low and the bowls were washed clean, he placed his own bowl near the newcomer's sleeping mat, not as a welcome, but as a mirror, because he knew he had once been the stranger, and now he was the one who stayed. They found it at sunrise. A single word traced into the thin layer of dust beside the chapel wall, not etched, not carved, just drawn with a finger. Soft, barely visible. By midday, the wind had taken most of it, but the shape lingered. Enough to be read, enough to be remembered. They didn't know who wrote it, but they knew who had been their last. He was the quiet one, not silent, just careful with sound. The kind of man who nodded instead of speaking, who smiled with his shoulders instead of his lips. He had grown slower over the past few months, climbed the steps one at a time, breathed with the heaviness of someone nearing the edge of something invisible, but he never asked for help, and no one offered it unless he dropped something, which he never did. That morning, they found him, still, not cold yet, not gone long. His hands were folded, his eyes closed, a faint smudge of dust on the back of his wrist, and beside him, the word "it" wasn't dramatic, not poetic, not even particularly beautiful in shape, just simple. Peace, that was all. The monks didn't touch it, didn't brush it away. They left it there, letting the morning light move across it slowly, like a breath stretched over stone. All day, they passed quietly, stepping around it, their footprints forming a soft ring around the word, like petals around a fallen stem. And no one spoke of it. No one needed to, because the desert speaks best through what vanishes. The prayer was not his final act. It was his offering, and in that moment, in that place, it felt enough. They buried him that evening. Simple shroud, no marker, only the memory of dust and light, and a single word that had stayed just long enough. Later, a younger monk asked in a whisper if it had been for them. The word, a message, a parting gift. An older monk placed his hand on the younger's shoulder, shook his head gently. It wasn't for us, he said, voice low. It was for the wind, because the monks understood that some prayers are meant to disappear, that the truest things are often the ones too light to hold, too soft to repeat, too sacred to preserve. They swept the chapel floor the next day, not carelessly, not hurried, just as needed, and when they reached the place where the word had been, they paused, let the broom hover, then passed over gently, letting the dust rise in a breathless puff before settling again. It was gone, but not lost, because the word had never been the point. It was the act of writing it, of placing it into the world, knowing it would not stay, and still choosing to do. It, that too, was prayer, not for attention, not for legacy, just because something inside needed to be given. There had been other prayers, of course, spoken aloud, sung under stars, carved faintly into wood, or pressed into damp clay, but this last one was different, because it asked for nothing, explained nothing. It simply existed. And then, like the monk who made it, it returned to the earth. Sometimes at dusk, a breeze moves through the chapel in a way that stirs a line across the floor, a faint sweep of dust that almost resembles a letter. Not quite, not always, but sometimes, and when that happens, Those who notice pause, just for a moment, not to read, not to remember, but to listen, because in the end, prayer is not what's written, it's what's felt, even after the word is gone, especially. After, there was a man who chose not to live inside in a roof. No doorway. No clay walls to block the wind or catch the heat. Just open air. Sky above. Earth below and in between. Him seated on a mat of palm leaves, his back against a stone worn smooth by decades of sitting. They called it his cell, though it was nothing. No structure. No borders. No shade, unless the sun decided to. Rest behind a cloud, but he stayed, not because he'd lost his shelter, but because he no longer needed one. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement. One day, he simply dragged his mat outside and never brought it back in. The others noticed. They watched him through slitted eyes as they swept the stone walkways or stirred the evening fires. But no one questioned him, because in the desert, everything eventually returns to sky. He had just done it early. At first, he arranged small stones. Around his sleeping space, a circle, a perimeter. Maybe out of habit. Maybe to remind the wind that he still claimed this spot as his own. But within weeks, the stones were scattered. He didn't replace them. Boundaries had become unnecessary. He prayed the same way he slept outside, facing east in the morning, west at dusk. Not out of ritual, but because that's where the light moved. He didn't shiver when the cold came. He just pulled his cloak tighter, buried his face in the crook of his arm, and breathed slowly until sleep took him again. When it rained, and it did, sometimes gently, without drama, he sat through it. Let it run down his spine. Let it soak the mat. He didn't move. It was as if the sky was his only ceiling, and he refused to step beneath anything smaller. A few monks brought him things: a second blanket, a bowl of figs, a cloth to wrap his shoulders. He accepted them all with a nod. Never with words. Sometimes he kept them. Sometimes he passed them to another monk before nightfall. As if the act of giving was more important than the thing itself, he aged under the open sky. The sun traced new lines across his brow. The stars remembered the rhythm of his sleep. He did not withdraw. He nodded in passing. Shared firewood when he had it. Watched the goats when no one else did, but he rarely entered a cell again. Not because he couldn't. Because he didn't see the need. His breath was prayer. His body offered to the elements like incense to an invisible altar. He became something different. Not more holy. Just more present. When birds circled above, he noticed. When the first shadow fell across the chapel wall each evening, he looked. Toward it, the world spoke to him in ways walls could never echo. One evening, a young monk asked him softly, "Aren't you afraid?" The man looked up, smiled, then looked around. The open sky, at the silent hills, at the sand folding in slow waves like sleeping breath. He didn't answer, because what would he say? That fear is smaller when you have nothing to protect. That peace is louder without ceilings. That sometimes the safest place is the one with no walls at all. So he said nothing. And the young monk, hearing more in that silence than in any explanation, bowed and left him alone. He died eventually, as they all did, not during a storm, not in pain, just in sleep. One cool morning, with the sun not yet risen and the sky still gray with unspoken promises, they found him just as he had lived under the open sky. His face turned east, his hands folded, his body wrapped in the soft hush of wind. They did not carry him inside. They buried him beneath the stars. No marker, just space, just silence, and for many nights after, monks would find themselves stepping out of their cells a little more often, sleeping with their doors open, sitting longer under the moon. As if, by his choice, he had reminded them of something they already knew, that shelter is not always safety, that walls can protect, but they can also separate, and that sometimes, to feel close to the divine, you need nothing between you and the sky. And now we return to silence. The same silence we began with, soft, worn, waiting, but it isn't empty. Not anymore, because in this silence live the monks who came with nothing and left even less. Men who disappeared into stone and sky and chose to call that holiness. Not because it was easy, but because it was enough to rise before the sun, enough to eat what the desert spared, enough to pray until words were no longer needed. This silence still breathes, through ruins where no footsteps fall, through clay bowls resting beneath dust, through cloaks folded by hands long gone. A tea lingers not in the grand, but in the small, the crease in a mat where a body once curled against the wind, the faint scent of oil in a wall that no longer stands, the low circle of stones, once a cell, now a shadow, and beyond it all, the vast forgiving sky, still watching, still listening, still remembering. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. This was never a story about saints. It was a story about men. Men who trembled, who wept without witnesses, who gave what little they had, again and again, and asked for nothing in return. They didn't change the world. They didn't seek to. They changed themselves gently, patiently, until even the desert knew their names, not the ones spoken aloud, the ones breathed into the stones, the ones whispered into bowls of water before sipping, the ones carved faintly into the rhythm of dust. The silence they left behind isn't still. It moves through memory, through imagination, through the soft exhale of someone listening now, in the quiet of their own room, wondering what it might feel like to let go, to release the noise, the striving, the ache to be more, and instead to simply be present. Small. Still, there's a kind of courage in that. The courage to disappear, not out of despair, but out of devotion. To say, this is enough. This life, simple and unadorned, is worthy, and to mean it, somewhere, a fire still smolders beneath a flat stone. Somewhere, a prayer still echoes between crumbling walls. Somewhere, the desert is still watching, not with judgment, but with patience, waiting for someone else to come, to kneel, to stay. You don't need to go there to feel it. The silence these monks cultivated, it isn't bound to geography. It lives wherever someone lights a small candle, wherever someone places a spoon gently into a bowl, wherever someone breathes deeply and lets the world fall quiet for just a moment. That too is a monastery. That too is sacred. We build so much around ourselves. Walls of thought, fortresses of sound. And sometimes all it takes to remember who we are is to step outside those walls. To sit beneath the sky, to feel the earth cool beneath us, to let a single breath say what no sentence ever could. That's where the monks lived. And that's where they live still. In silence that hums, in stillness that teaches, in the gentle refusal to be more than what you are. The desert is quiet now. The cloaks have long turned to dust. The bowls have cracked. The footsteps have faded. But the silence still breathes, and somewhere in that breath, you might find a part of yourself you didn't know was missing, not broken, not lost, just waiting.